2 Kings 6, 8 through 23. Once when the king of Aram was at war with Israel, he took counsel with his officers. He said, "At such and such a place shall be my camp." But the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, "Take care not to pass this place, because the Arameans are going down there." The king of Israel sent word to the place of which the man of God spoke. More than once or twice he warned such a place so that it was on the alert. The mind of the king of Aram was greatly perturbed because of this. He called his officers and said to them, "Now tell me, who among us sides with the king of Israel?" Then one of his officers said, "No one, my lord king. It is Elisha, the prophet in Israel, who tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedchamber." He said, "Go and find where he is. I will send and seize him." He was told he is in Dothan. So he sent horses and chariots there, and a great army. They came by night and surrounded the city. When the attendant of the man of God rose in the morning and went out, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. His servants said, "Alas, master, what shall we do?" He replied, "Do not be afraid, for there are more with us than there are with them." Then Elisha prayed, "O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see." So the Lord opened the eyes of the servant, and he saw. The mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. When the Arameans came down against him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, "Strike the people, please, with blindness." So he struck them with blindness as Elisha had asked. Elisha said to them, "This is not the way, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek." And he led them to Samaria. As soon as they entered Samaria, Elisha said, "O Lord, open the eyes of these men so that they may see." The Lord opened their eyes, and they saw that they were inside Samaria. When the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, "Father, shall I kill them? Shall I kill them?" He answered, "No. Did you capture with your sword and your bow those whom you want to kill? Set food and water before them so that they may eat and drink, and let them go to their master." So he prepared for them a great feast. After they ate and drank, he sent them on their way, and they went to their master. And the Arameans no longer came raiding into the land of Israel. Father, please take what happens here, words, thoughts, and prayers, and make it acceptable to you. Amen. Grace, peace, and mercy are yours from the triune God. It was my first day back on campus after summer break, and I was happy to be back. Don't get me wrong, I loved my parents, and I loved hanging out in Metairie, and I didn't hate my summer job. I also liked this project I was working on. A friend named Mark and I were putting together a musical. It was called Inferno, and it was about a journey through hell with a 17-year-old kid who died in a car wreck. It was meant to be performed in a planetarium. Mark wrote the words and lyrics. I was writing the music. I was happy to be back on campus, being on my own again, going to class again, learning dozens of new things every day again, seeing my friends again. This was pre-Facebook. This was even pre-internet. Talking to my friends over the summer would have involved something called a long-distance call, and those were expensive, so I didn't know anything about their summers. Yes, it was my first day back on campus, and I was happy. Walking across the quad in the afternoon, my friend Carol and I saw each other. She gave me a smile, a very nice smile. The kind of smile, warm and bright and pretty, the kind of smile that makes you feel special and beautiful, and, well, I was already happy. It was the kind of smile you hold onto in your heart. Carol was a friend, but I didn't think she was the kind of friend who would give me such a gift. She and I fast walked toward each other. Carol wrapped her arms around me and squeezed hard. I was more than a little surprised. I hugged her back. "It's good to see you, Tim," she said when we finally let go. "It good see too," I managed to pull out of my very confused, very busy brain. We each had somewhere to go, but we agreed to meet later and talk. I wasn't quite sure what to make of that. Like I said, Carol was a friend, but not particularly close. Did Carol think differently about me? Had she spent the summer coming to the realization that I was an amazing guy and that she had never really appreciated me? I mean, it was about time somebody realized how incredibly cool I was. Carol was smart and fun and kind and pretty. Why not her? Later on that day, we saw each other again with time to talk. Carol told me she was really flustered dealing with all the little stupid things that crop up as part of every day, and that she still hadn't really gotten over Mark's funeral. While the phrase Mark's funeral should have stood out, I didn't think much of it at the time. Mark was the guy I was writing the musical with. When Carol said Mark's funeral, I figured she meant that Mark's aunt or grandfather had died, or something like that. You know, that funeral Mark had to go to, Mark's funeral. When the conversation circled around, I asked Carol who died and how was Mark taking it. "Oh my God," Carol said, "not in any way taking the Lord's name in vain. You don't know. Mark's dead." Days before, Mark had been killed by a 45-year-old drunk driver just feet from campus. He was dead instantly. His funeral was that morning. On top of the shock and the growing sense of loss, there was something that troubled me much, much more. I had been so blind. Not only had I been happily walking around campus the day of my friend's funeral, I had completely misinterpreted Carol's wondrous smile and hug earlier. Carol had seen me, smiled at me, hugged me because she thought I was grieving. And she wanted me to know that I wasn't grieving alone. She was sharing her brokenness with my brokenness. What a fool I was. Yes, I know I couldn't have known. No one told me. It's not my fault that I didn't see. But there were plenty of signs that something was very wrong on campus. And looking back after Carol opened my eyes, I could see them. There was sadness all around, and I chose to ignore it because I was happy. There were friends of mine who were nearly in tears, but I paid it no heed because I was feeling great. I'm not saying I did anything wrong. It's just that it's important for me to see the world as clearly as I can. And that morning, I didn't see the world at all. The Bible text for this sermon is not in the weekly lectionary, and so there's a reasonably good chance you've never heard a sermon on it. It starts with a blind king. Not blind like Stevie Wonder, but blind nonetheless. The king of Aram probably considered himself quite important, even though most people these days don't even know there ever was a kingdom named Aram. Still, he couldn't even seem to get set a decent ambush on the Israelite army. The Israelites always knew about the ambushes, and when the other side knows about your ambush, you're pretty much just sitting around while they find another way. The blind king thinks there's a traitor passing secrets to the Israelites, which seems pretty reasonable, but it's completely wrong. It turns out that the Israelite prophet Elisha knows everything the king says, either because Elisha has God-given mystical mind-reading powers, or because the king is as dumb as he is blind, and Elisha has just figured him out. Either reading of the text is possible. What follows is a pretty typical overreaction of a powerful person who ends up feeling stupid. The king of wherever it was sent an army to pick up this one guy, because Elijah's never going to see that coming. Oh, and by the way, this army sent to pick up Elijah is the only army we're going to need to worry about from now on. The Israelite army could have just stayed home and taken a nap for the rest of the story. All right, so right here is my favorite part of the story. It's early morning. Rooster crows. Elijah's servant drags himself out of bed. Stretch. Ah, well, he thinks, a water bucket isn't going to fill itself. He grabs a bucket and opens the door. It's a good walk to the well, but at least it's not too cold, and there are all those soldiers and chariots on the hill surrounding the city. Wait. What? The servant runs back inside and tells Elijah that there's an army parked outside, and he'd better think of something fast or they were both going to die. Because you see, the servant was blind. Not blind like Stevie Wonder, but blind nonetheless. Elijah asks God, and God gives sight to the blind. Suddenly, the servant sees that just behind the army of the king of wherever it was an army of angels. Where the king's army had horses and chariots, the angel army had horses and chariots of fire. Don't be afraid, for there are more with us than there are with them. Apartheid in South Africa was a system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination, where a tiny minority of white people controlled almost all the wealth and power. And the black people, who were the vast majority, South Africa is in Africa after all, were beaten, jailed, or killed if they even tried to resist. It ended in 1991. I know, it should have ended in 1891 if it were ever going to get started. But before the end of apartheid, there was an ecumenical service at the Cathedral of St. George, the Martyr, in Cape Town, South Africa. I heard this story from Jim Wallace, who was there. The service was to be led by a black archbishop named Desmond Tutu. It was a substitute for a political rally that the government disallowed. To make sure he understood the point that being a man of the cloth didn't make him special, the government jailed Archbishop Tutu for several days prior to the event. The blind government. Not blind like Stevie Wonder, but blind nonetheless. At the service, just as Archbishop Tutu stood to speak, hundreds of police pushed into the crowded cathedral, armed not just with guns, but with notepads and tape recorders, trying to intimidate the man, trying to make sure he stayed in control. Nevertheless, the Archbishop preached what he was going to preach about the evils of apartheid. He declared that this injustice wouldn't endure. And then he talked to the policeman. "You are powerful," he said. "You are very powerful, but you are not gods, and I serve a God who cannot be mocked. So since you've already lost, I invite you today to come and join the winning side." The packed house stood and started dancing. The policeman didn't know what to do. Don't be afraid, for there are more with us than there are with them. Going back to the Elisha story, the army of the king of wherever it was started to attack when Elisha asked God to make them blind, and God makes them blind. Not blind like Stevie Wonder. Blind more like the stormtroopers in the original Star Wars. These aren't the droids you're looking for. Elijah comes up to the army and says, "Elisha, oh yeah, I know the guy. He doesn't live here. Come on, I'll show you where to find him." The blind army follows the prophet until he takes them to Samaria, one of the capitals of Israel at the time. I know, that might sound weird, but this was long before the Good Samaritan story. It's kind of complicated. But in the Israelite capital, we then meet the second blind king of this story. Not blind like Stevie Wonder. The Israelite king is overjoyed to see an army of his enemy walking happily into his capital. He goes up to Elijah. "Do you want me to kill him?" He asks. "I want to kill him. It's okay to kill him, right?" You see, for blind kings, the only answer is power. Kill your enemies. enemies or anyone who crosses or disagrees with you. Crush them, smash them. But Elisha is not blind. In fact, he and his servant are the only ones in this whole story who aren't. He asks the king if the king's power brought these men to him. It did not. He tells the king to feed these men, show them hospitality, and then send them home. The king of Israel might have been blind, but he wasn't stupid. He listened to the man who had kept his armies alive all this time. He gave the army a great feast, and then sent them back to wherever it was. And instead of the blind king of wherever it was avenging the loss of his army, he chose to keep to his own side of the river. He had just sent an army after one man and had them return talking about how good Israelite cooking was, and maybe asking why their own king never served them a feast like that. There's something important about this story that maybe you missed. The only way the servant could see the army of angels is for him to look at the army of the king of wherever it was. Hiding your eyes in the face of what frightens you does not help you see better. I know, it sounds obvious when I say it like that. The only way that Elisha manages to keep from being blind is that he keeps his eyes open and he keeps his attention on God. And by that I don't mean looking heavenly with a blissful smile. I mean keeping his eyes here, in this world, this place where God is. He could see because he was paying attention to the people around him, people who God loved and in whom is God's image. Elisha sees his servant frightened and asks God to give him comfort. What the servant and both kings see as an army and a threat, Elijah sees as men and gives them hospitality. What the world sees as kings, Elijah sees as men, often blinded by fear and lust for power. Archbishop Tutu saw the people around him, the oppressed and afraid, and stood with them, inviting their oppressors to join them. When Carol smiled at me and hugged me all those years ago, I was blinded by my own happiness. I looked at myself, how good I felt, and I missed what was going on around me. After my eyes were open, I saw the real gift in Carol's smile and hug, the way the other people at my college looked to help those who were mourning, worked to grieve with them, and help them through the shock and the loss. And now, looking back and looking forward, I can see, dimly to be sure, but I can see God in everything around, God's love lifting up the lost and lonely and forgotten, even giving sight to the blind. No, it's not all rosy rainbows and lollipops. There is real danger here, real torment, real harm being done to real people with no voice, no power, no money, nothing, it seems, but for God's love. But I try to remember Elisha's words. Don't be afraid, for there are more with us than there are with them. I try to look through the army of terror and pride and hate and spite and see the army of angels behind. Sometimes, thanks to God, I can see them. Sometimes, thanks to God, I can even hear God's voice to us, to all of us, in the words of a blind man. Blind exactly like Stevie Wonder. You are the sunshine of my life, God says. That's why I'll always stay around. You are the apple of my eye, God says. Forever you'll stay in my heart. Don't be afraid, for there are more with us than there are with them.